The biting Wisconsin cold of 1944 cut through the thin, torn uniforms of the Japanese soldiers as the train doors clattered open. They stepped down onto the snow-packed ground at Camp McCoy, blinking against the pale, unforgiving light. Their faces were etched with the clear signs of the Pacific War: hollow cheeks, tired eyes, and lips cracked from weeks of short rations and grueling transport. Every man there had been taught the single, ironclad lesson of the Imperial Army. Capture was shame. Capture was worse than death. They had been warned for years. The propaganda machine of the Emperor's military had painted the Americans as brutal, lawless barbarians who would torture them, starve them, and humiliate them until they begged for mercy. Most had prepared themselves, in the core of their being, to be struck down the moment they left the train, choosing mental defiance over physical surrender. They expected the end, not survival. Instead, what they saw made them hesitate, a collective pause of pure confusion. Rows of functional wooden barracks stood starkly against the snow. Guard towers and barbed wire marked the perimeter, and a few sentries stood watch with rifles. Yet the atmosphere was wrong. It was not the savage, chaotic dungeon they had pictured. There was order here, a strange kind of quiet, almost dull routine. Trucks passed through the camp roads, and smoke from kitchen chimneys carried the smell of cooking food, a rich, fatty scent, far stronger than the weak, sour soups they had survived on for months in the islands. The prisoners exchanged nervous glances. Some kept their eyes low, unwilling to betray even a spark of curiosity, a slight which could be interpreted as a surrender of spirit. The guards shouted commands in crisp, fast English. The prisoners did not understand the words, but the tone was firm and authoritative, not savage or hateful. Interpreters moved quickly among them, relaying the instructions. Line up. Move forward. Do not break formation. What truly startled them was the presence of neutral observers. Red Cross officials stood discreetly on the sidelines, clipboards in hand. That presence alone was a massive psychological shock. Back home, they had been told America was brutal and indifferent to international treaties. Yet here were outsiders, ensuring the rules of the Geneva Convention were being followed. Could this really be real? The fear still lived in their chests, but it was now laced with suspicion. It must be a trick. Wait for the punishment. The intake process itself was mechanical but shocking in its humanity. Men were deloused. Their lice-infested uniforms were quickly taken and burned. Medical checks were carried out to measure fever, malnutrition, and injuries. A Japanese soldier with a crudely bandaged arm expected to be ignored. Instead, an American medic inspected the wound, meticulously cleaned it, and dressed it again with fresh gauze. The soldier sat frozen, unable to reconcile the simple, professional act of care with the image of the barbaric enemy drilled into him since childhood. One prisoner whispered to another in raw disbelief, "Why would they do this?" "We are not their men. We are nothing." Another shook his head. "It must be a trick. Wait." Yet each hour revealed something stranger, an unwavering adherence to procedure. They were marched across the yard to their new quarters. The barracks, though rough, were heated with stoves, lined with bunks, and stocked with thick wool blankets. It was not home, not freedom, but it was shelter, a warmth they had not felt in years. A few prisoners sat heavily on the mattresses, testing them with their palms, as though afraid the softness would vanish. It was a reminder that this was captivity. Yet inside, the men noticed something they could not ignore. The camp was run like a machine, yes, but not like a dungeon. All their lives they had been told that capture meant degradation, that surrender stripped them of honor, reducing them to animals. But here, the first images imprinted themselves differently. A guard helping a sick man steady himself on the ice, a medic carefully wrapping gauze, a Red Cross representative checking that rations were being distributed fairly. The fear lingered, sharp and cold, but as night came, and they lay on cots under real thick blankets, They could not help but wonder if the greatest shock was not captivity itself, but how captivity looked. It was nothing like the nightmare they had braced for. The next morning, the prisoners woke not to blows or shouted insults, but to a bugle call. The sound startled many of them, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. They had heard the same notes in their own camps back in Japan. For a moment, some forgot where they were. They were ordered into formation, roll called, and directed toward the mess hall. The fear of what might come next sat heavy in their chests. Many expected food would be withheld, or they would be fed scraps unfit for animals. But before food came, procedures. A Red Cross representative addressed them through an interpreter, explaining their rights under the Geneva Convention. They would be fed, housed, and allowed to write letters home. They would work, but only under certain conditions. They would not be abused. Neutral officials would visit regularly to ensure the rules were respected. The words were met with silence and disbelief.
They speak of rights, but we are their captives.
Why would they bother? One soldier muttered. The interpreter paused. These are not promises. These are rules, for you, for them. They are binding. The weight of those words hung in the air. After more medical checks, the prisoners were weighed, and many came in severely underweight. No one mocked them. A corporal even handed out vitamins, small, chalky tablets that puzzled the men. Medicine for enemies? It was almost insulting in its kindness. By the afternoon, they were given fresh, serviceable uniforms marked with PW in large letters. The warmth was immediate. The guards were another surprise. They enforced order without cruelty. When one elderly prisoner stumbled on the icy path, a guard reached down and pulled him up by the arm. No kick, no sneer, just a curt nod before walking on. It was deeply confusing. That night, lying on their bunks, conversations ran low. "Can you believe them?" one man asked. "They speak of rules as though this is an arrangement." "Do they not hate us?" another replied. "They must be pretending to trap us, to make us speak." And yet, the smell from the kitchens carried over again. Thick, rich, fatty. The Americans, it seemed, did not consider food to be a weapon. For them, it was routine. But for the Japanese prisoners, who had surrendered with bellies hollow and skin stretched tight, that smell was almost unbearable. The shock of the rules and the warmth lingered, but it would not compare to what waited in the mess hall itself, where hunger and memory would collide with the hamburger and Coca-Cola. The next morning at Camp McCoy brought a routine that only served to sharpen the psychological conflict. After roll call, the prisoners were marched toward the mess hall. Fear of starvation and humiliation, drilled into them since recruitment, sat heavy in their stomachs, even as the smell of rich cooking food grew stronger. The anticipation of the meal was an agony of conflicting emotions. They had lived through the constant, gnawing hunger of the Pacific Islands, where meals had dwindled to watery rice or bitter roots. Meat was a rarity, and sugar almost mythical. They expected scraps, if not outright mockery. But before the food, there were the rules. The Red Cross representative addressed them again, reiterating their rights under the Geneva Convention. They were not merely captives. They were individuals protected by international law. These are not promises, the interpreter emphasized. These are rules. They are binding. The weight of those words, the realization that their enemy was adhering to a code of conduct their own military had often disregarded, was a heavy burden of shame and confusion. The attack of abundance. Then came the food line. The slow movement of their boots across the mess hall floor brought them closer to the source of the rich, smoky scent. The prisoners clutched their tin trays like shields, waiting for the predictable humiliation. But when the first soldier stepped forward, an American cook, sleeves rolled high, dropped a hot, thick meat patty onto a soft bun, added fried potatoes to the side, and finally reached for a glass bottle, sweating with condensation. He popped the cap and slid it onto the tray. The red script on the label was unfamiliar. "Coca-Cola," a guard explained curtly. The Japanese soldier stared at the tray as if it were a trap. His hand trembled. Meat. They were giving them fresh meat. As the trays began to fill, disbelief deepened. The bun was soft, the potatoes fried, golden. In the corner of the hall, the bottle of Coca-Cola frothed as though alive. The prisoners sat at long wooden tables, eyeing the food cautiously, like men who had stumbled into forbidden territory. A few brought the fizzy, sweating bottle to their lips. The sweetness exploded first, followed by the sharp burn of carbonation in their throats. Some gagged, coughing from the shock. Others widened their eyes in pure astonishment. One man laughed, an uncontrolled burst that quickly turned into muffled sobbing, his shoulders shaking with a mixture of shock and relief. A thin soldier, his ribs still visible beneath his new uniform, lifted his hamburger with both hands. He sniffed it, then bit in. Grease ran down his chin. He froze, chewing slowly, savoring the taste of fat and salt, a flavor he had completely forgotten. He lowered his face, hiding the sudden, uncontrollable tears. "I had forgotten the taste of fat," he whispered to a bunkmate. "It is too much." At another table, the philosophical debate began instantly. "They want to make us weak," one argued fiercely. "They fatten us so we forget our cause and betray the emperor." "Or," his companion replied, chewing slowly, "they simply eat like this every day." That idea was harder to swallow than the food itself. This was not a carefully orchestrated feast meant to impress or humiliate. This was the Americans' daily routine. They ate the same hamburger and fries, washed it down with the same bottle of Coke, and thought nothing of it. For the American guards and cooks, feeding prisoners was simply procedure. But for the Japanese soldiers, who had surrendered with hollow bellies and had marched half dead through the jungle, the meal was an assault on their core assumptions. They had expected savagery. They received normal, abundant American cuisine. The shame was sharp, but the overwhelming relief of survival was sharper still. The casual cruelty of abundance. The shock deepened when the prisoners realized the sheer normality of the situation. The Americans were not celebrating their victory over these men. They were not taunting them. This was simply Tuesday dinner. This casual, effortless abundance hit harder than any insult could have. Here were men who had been told that America was a soft, starving nation on the brink of collapse. Yet, in captivity, they were eating better than they had as free soldiers of the Imperial Army. By the time the trays were emptied and the bottles drained, the prisoners sat in a stunned silence. The guards called for order, ushering the men back to their barracks. They filed out, still dazed, whispering among themselves about the strange sweetness and the greasy, unforgettable flavor. That night, lying under the thick wool blankets, the memory of the meal stayed with them, not just as food, but as proof. Proof that their enemy lived in a world where sweetness could be wasted on prisoners, where meat was so common it could be shaped into patties and handed out without thought. One prisoner, a man who had faced grenades on Guadalcanal, confessed to his bunkmate, "The sweetness of the Coca-Cola felt like a dream gone wrong, too gentle to belong in war." The initial terror of capture had been replaced by a different kind of fear, the fear of realizing that everything they had been told was a lie. Food was only the beginning. Once the routines of daily life inside Camp McCoy took hold, the prisoners would face a new challenge, living with order, boredom, and moments of humanity that tested everything they thought they knew about honor and survival. With the initial shock of the hamburger and the wool blankets subsiding, a new, more insidious psychological challenge took hold at Camp McCoy. The crushing monotony of routine. Each morning, the prisoners of war woke to the sound of the bugle, the crunch of American boots in the frost, and the sight of the barbed wire, a constant reminder that no matter how comfortable their physical lives were, this was still a prison. After breakfast, the prisoners were divided into groups for work details. Some shoveled snow, others cut wood, and still others were sent to labor on nearby farms under guard supervision. The work was steady, necessary, but not brutal. This surprised many of the men who had expected to be used to the point of exhaustion, a final physical breaking. Instead, they were paid small wages in camp coupons which could be exchanged at the camp canteen. The canteen was another devastating psychological weapon. Here they could purchase necessities like toiletries and writing paper, but also luxuries, candy, chewing gum, and cigarettes. One afternoon, a Japanese soldier held up a chocolate bar he had purchased. "In Japan," he murmured to a fellow prisoner, "this is medicine. Here they give it away to soldiers like it is nothing." His friend could only shake his head in silent disbelief. The very existence of the canteen, where prisoners and American soldiers casually bought the same items, shattered the myth of American decadence and scarcity propagated by the imperial regime. War was raging in Europe and the Pacific, yet here in Wisconsin the Americans lived as though their abundance would never run dry. The void of purpose. However, the daily structure of camp life, while physically restorative, began to press down in a different way. There was no fighting, no advancing, no dying comrades to bury. The mind, once entirely consumed by the imperative of survival in the jungle, now had space to wander. And with that wandering came a deep, unsettling sense of loss of purpose. Letters became the prisoner's only lifeline. The camp allowed each man to write 2 letters and 4 postcards per month, though they were heavily censored. Men hunched over tables, trying to capture the memory of their homes in ink. "I am alive" was often all they could manage. For those who received no letters back, the silence grew heavier with each passing week, a psychological burden of isolation and uncertainty about their families' fates. To combat the crushing boredom, English classes were offered in the evenings. A few curious prisoners attended, repeating words slowly after the American teacher. Bread, table, window. Others scoffed, insisting there was no use in learning the enemy's tongue. But even the skeptics listened from their bunks, their ears pricking at the strange rhythm of the words. The desire to understand the world outside the wire, a world that was clearly winning the war, was a powerful, silent motivator. The guards themselves were a source of continual confusion. They were strict, armed, and watchful, but they enforced order without cruelty. When one elderly prisoner stumbled on an icy path, a guard offered a curt nod and a steady arm, not a kick or a sneer. Not all interactions were gentle, however. A raw tension lingered, particularly when the prisoners were on work details outside the camp. An American farmer, whose son had been killed in the Pacific, once watched a work crew and, in an act of pure, distilled hatred, spat on the ground near a prisoner's feet. "Should have left them to starve," he muttered. This moment of raw human bitterness, quickly noted and recounted back in the barracks, was strangely reassuring to some of the prisoners. "Not all Americans follow their rules," one man grimly noted. "Of course not," his bunkmate replied. "They are men like us. Some will hate, some will not." The war in the barracks. The central conflict of the camp was not between captor and captive, but among the prisoners themselves. In the dim light of the barracks, bitter arguments erupted. Some clung fiercely to the idea that Japan would triumph, that these months of captivity were merely a temporary delay before ultimate victory. They repeated the slogans of the imperial army like prayers. "You dishonor our homeland when you speak of defeat," one prisoner shouted at a man who admitted the losses were inevitable. "And you dishonor reason by denying what is before your eyes," the other snapped back, pointing to the abundance and the endless stream of supplies pouring into the American base. The most painful question was the one that followed those exchanges. If survival is betrayal, Then what did dying hungry on Saipan achieve? Silence and shame followed those words. The men who attended English class or showed interest in the American lifestyle were accused of betraying their honor. Was survival worth adaptation? Did every moment of laughter with a guard chip away at the essential Yamato Damashi, Japanese spirit? One prisoner wrote secretly in his diary, trying to wrestle with the contradictions. We were told Americans were animals, yet they share their gum, they heal our wounds. Which is the lie? Which is the truth? The enemy had failed to break them with violence, as predicted. Instead, they were being broken by a steady, relentless stream of normality, comfort, and order. The kindness itself felt like a humiliation, a reminder that they lived better as captives in the enemy's country than their families lived back home. The longer they remained in the wire, the more they were forced to face the horrifying question of what loyalty truly meant when the supposed enemy offered a better, more humane existence than the nation they had been prepared to die for. For weeks, Camp McCoy ran like clockwork. The strict rhythm of orders, work, and meals was predictable, even dull. Yet in between those rigid routines, small cracks began to open, where genuine human connection flickered. Moments that neither side could have imagined when the war began. It often started with the simplest thing: language. Few Japanese prisoners spoke English beyond a handful of words, and most Americans in the camp knew no Japanese. Commands were given through interpreters, but necessity pushed both sides to improvise. A guard might point at a shovel and bark, "Work!" A prisoner, catching the sound, would repeat it awkwardly under his breath, "Waku." Soon others did the same, laughing quietly at their own clumsy attempts. One evening during an English class, an American instructor wrote the word family on the chalkboard. He asked for a volunteer to say it aloud. A prisoner stood, hesitated, then said, "Fam-re." The class burst into laughter, not cruel but genuine, and the teacher smiled. The prisoner smiled too, his face softening for the first time in weeks. In that instant, the label of enemy gave way to something more ordinary. Men trying to bridge a gap. Food became a common ground once again, but in a new, smaller way. On rare occasions, guards shared cigarettes or chewing gum with prisoners during work details. The gum baffled them. One man chewed for a few minutes, then swallowed it whole. The Americans roared with laughter, shaking their heads and trying to explain the purpose of the strange, non-edible sweet. Soon, gum became a small symbol of exchange. A guard offering, a prisoner accepting with a stiff, formal bow. However, the reality of hatred was never far away. On a farm outside the camp, where a group of POWs worked clearing fields, an American farmer watched them closely. His son had been killed in the Pacific, and resentment boiled in his stare. When one prisoner bent to pick up a dropped tool, the farmer spat on the ground near his feet. The guard escorting the work crew noticed, but said nothing, simply walking closer to the prisoner. The tension was raw, unspoken, and immediate. The farmer turned away, muttering, "Should have left them to starve." That moment, quickly shared among the prisoners, confirmed their initial suspicions. Not all Americans followed their rules. But it also strengthened the internal contradiction. They had faced the pure, unadulterated hatred of the farmer, yet the guard's subtle protection and the steady meals confirmed that the rules, the principle of order and law, were stronger than any individual's rage. Dialogue in images. Moments of deep, unexpected connection often bypassed language entirely. A young guard named Miller, barely 20, often lingered near the barracks after duty. He carried photographs of his family, showing them to prisoners who gathered near the fence. A mother, a father, 2 small sisters. The prisoners did not understand his words, but they understood the faces. In turn, prisoners traced shapes in the dirt, sketching their own homes, their villages, their wives waiting oceans away. It was not dialogue in words, but dialogue in images. One evening, Miller managed to say slowly, "Mother, Father, America." He pointed to the photos. A prisoner nodded, touched his chest, and said in Japanese, "Haha, chichi, imoto." The exchange lasted only moments before another guard ordered Miller away, but the seed was planted. They had spoken across the chasm, if only for an instant. The enemy was not faceless. Still, loyalty to the emperor was not erased by hamburgers or shared photographs. Among the Japanese, the internal struggle grew fiercer. Some men whispered warnings against softening, accusing fellow prisoners who attended English classes of betraying their honor. Arguments flared in the dim light of the barracks. Was survival worth adaptation? Or did every moment of comfort chip away at their identity? One snowy afternoon, a work crew was clearing a road outside the camp when a group of American children approached. They were curious, bold, their cheeks red from the cold. One girl held out a candy bar, offering it through the wire to a Japanese prisoner. He froze. He had faced bombs, bullets, and hunger, but the innocent gesture of a child terrified him more than any weapon. Slowly, he took the candy, bowed low, and said in halting English, "Thank you." The girl smiled and skipped back to her friends. That night, the man confessed to his bunkmates that he felt more broken by that small kindness than by all the battles he had endured. "A child of the enemy," he whispered, "gave me food with a smile. How can I hate her?" Such moments left scars of confusion. They did not erase loyalty, but they made the line between friend and foe blurrier than propaganda ever admitted. As the war dragged toward its bitter end, the contradictions inside Camp McCoy only grew heavier, forcing the prisoners to face the question of what loyalty really meant. Loyalty to a dying idea that brought starvation, or loyalty to the undeniable truth that offered life and humanity. By the winter of 1945, the routines of Camp McCoy had settled into a predictable cycle, but beneath the surface, the conflict only grew sharper. The Japanese prisoners were no longer starving, they were physically stable. But this stability sharpened the deeper internal conflict. The agonizing question of how to reconcile their current humane treatment with the fierce hatred and loyalty they still carried for the emperor and the homeland. The men clung fiercely to propaganda in the barracks, repeating the slogans of certain victory like a desperate prayer. But the evidence around them mocked those words. Outside the wire, the prisoners saw American farmers with tractors, barns full of livestock, and fields that seemed endless. Inside the camp, Coca-Cola bottles arrived by the crate. Abundance here was not fantasy, it was normal. Letters from home made the contradictions sting even sharper. When a prisoner received word that his family in Osaka was surviving on boiled weeds and scraps of barley, he held the paper in shaking hands while the smell of roast beef drifted from the mess hall. The gulf between his life as a well-fed prisoner and his children's life as starving civilians under bombing raids became unbearable. "I eat like a soldier," he confessed quietly, "while my children starve." The shame of survival guilt became the dominant force. It wasn't only food. Warmth itself became a symbol. In barracks heated by stoves and stocked with thick wool blankets, the men remembered their families shivering in wooden houses with glass shattered by air raids. Captivity offered them safety, yet it deepened their guilt and made their continued loyalty feel hollow. The questioning of loyalty. The contradictions began to break some men quietly. One evening, a prisoner whispered through tears, "I believed Japan was the center of the world. But now I see. Perhaps we are only one small island." His bunkmate quickly silenced him, warning him never to speak such treason aloud. But the thought had been voiced, and such thoughts, once released, could not be taken back. Religion added another layer to the confusion. Some prisoners gathered in hushed circles, reciting prayers to ancestors, desperately clinging to tradition. Others watched American chaplains lead services for their own men. Curiosity flickered. A few even attended, if only to sit in the warmth of the chapel. They did not understand the hymns, but they recognized the universal act of faith, a human hunger for hope that was the same in both cultures.
Perhaps the most painful contradiction came during Red Cross inspections. The officials asked the prisoners if they were treated well. Most answered yes, because it was true. But afterward, in the barracks, shame swept over them. "We admit our enemy treats us fairly," one man lamented, "while our own nation cannot feed us. What does that make us?" No one had an answer. The truth they were forced to acknowledge stripped them of the last shred of their ideological dignity. One snowy afternoon, the moment of ultimate cognitive breakdown occurred. A work crew was clearing a road outside the camp when a group of American children approached. One girl held out a candy bar, offering it through the wire. The prisoner, who had faced death without flinching, was terrified by the innocent gesture. He took the candy, bowed low, and in halting English said, "Thank you." That night, he confessed to his bunkmates that he felt more broken by that small kindness than by all the battles he had endured. "A child of the enemy," he whispered, "gave me food with a smile. How can I hate her?" And these moments did not erase their loyalty to the emperor, but they made the line between friend and foe blurrier than propaganda had ever admitted. The war, the great ideological crusade, was being defeated not by a massive final battle, but by a steady drip of mercy and chocolate. As 1945 pressed on, the news filtering into the camp confirmed their worst fears. The massive bombing of Tokyo, the devastating losses in the Philippines. Each new report widened the contradiction. Inside the barbed wire, they lived with steady meals and safety. Outside, their nation was burning. But captivity, no matter how humane, could not last forever. The terrifying question loomed. What would happen when the gates finally opened, and they returned to a homeland scarred by fire and hunger, where the living had starved, and the prisoners had flourished? By the summer of 1945, the world outside Camp McCoy had irrevocably shifted. Whispers of great victories and devastating losses turned into headlines in American newspapers that the prisoners occasionally glimpsed. When the news of Hiroshima and Nagasaki struck, a horror the prisoners could not fully grasp raced through the camp. Most did not understand the atomic bomb, but the scale of the catastrophe bled through every word. Then came the truth they could not ignore. Japan had surrendered. The announcement fell over the camp like a physical weight. Some prisoners stared blankly at the ground, while others wept in silence, their shoulders shaking under thin blankets. For years they had clung to the belief that their nation could not fall, that death was preferable to defeat. Now defeat had arrived while they were behind barbed wire, unable to lift a weapon or choose their own fate. The guards did not gloat. They simply carried on with the routines, meals, roll calls, inspections. For many prisoners, that steady, unwavering routine was unbearable. "They treat us the same," one man whispered bitterly, "whether we are warriors or defeated. Do they not see our shame?" The final inventory. The camp was quickly prepared for repatriation. The Red Cross organized lists and transport schedules. Prisoners were given clean uniforms, medical checkups, and briefings about the long journey back across the Pacific. They would be shipped home not as soldiers of a victorious empire, but as survivors of a defeated nation. The departure was not triumphant. On the morning of the transfer, the prisoners filed out of their barracks, clutching small bundles of belongings, a wooden carving, a carefully folded letter, or perhaps a worn copy of the American Constitution given to them by a curious guard. As they passed through the gates, many glanced back one last time at the camp that had held them. It was not fondness that moved them, but a deep, complex confusion. The place where they had expected cruelty had instead given them hamburgers, Coca-Cola, thick blankets, and glimpses of human kindness.
The journey home was long and heavy. On the ship, men huddled together, consumed by fear and guilt. What awaited them in Japan? Cities were gone, families scattered, and hunger was worse than when they had left. They worried about being branded cowards, despised for having lived as prisoners. The guilt was sharp, but so was another memory they could not erase: the taste of that first meal in Camp McCoy. One man, scribbling in a worn notebook during the voyage, wrote, "I thought my enemy would break me with violence. Instead, he broke me with food. I cannot erase the taste of bread, meat, and sweetness. It will follow me home like a shadow." The unspoken truth. When the prisoners finally stepped onto Japanese soil, the reality of defeat struck hard. Bombed ruins stretched where cities once stood. Families met them with tears, relief, and sometimes bitterness. Those who had starved and survived questioned the men who had returned fat and healthy. The returning prisoners faced unspoken accusations of weakness, of dishonor. In their silence, they carried stories no one at home wanted to hear. Stories of Americans who treated them by rules instead of rage, of a guard sharing a photograph, of a child offering candy. They admitted that the American captivity had forced them to see the enemy not as monsters, but as men with codes of order and an unimaginable capacity for production. In the years that followed, few spoke openly about their time in America. They buried the memories under layers of duty and shame. Yet, even in silence, the contradictions lived on. The legacy of Camp McCoy was not found in battles or victories, but in those quiet, disorienting moments when food, kindness, and order had collided with fear and loyalty. For those Japanese prisoners, the taste of Coca-Cola and the grease of a hamburger became symbols of survival, but also of a devastating realization. The enemy's strength lay not in fanatical spirit, but in a stable, abundant, and ordered system. They learned that humanity could exist even in the middle of war, and that sometimes mercy cuts deeper than hatred. The ultimate victory of America in Camp McCoy was not the capture of the soldiers, but the conversion of their minds.